How did the most complete team in football end up missing the playoffs altogether and firing their longtime head coach? Welcome back to With the First Pick. In this edition, The Perfect Fix. We got to fix the Baltimore Ravens. I'm Ryan Wilson. That's former Titans GM Rand Carthon. Before we get going here, Ravens fans, let us know now that John Harbaugh has been relieved of his duties, who do you want as your next head coach? And second, after that, what's the first thing you're fixing to get this team back on track? All right, Rand. They fired John Harbaugh in Baltimore after 18 years. He led that team to the Super Bowl after the 2012 season. They missed the playoffs in heartbreaking fashion last week in that Week 18 loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Harbaugh was also 4-7 in his last 11 postseason games, and when you have a franchise quarterback, that's sometimes a hard pill to swallow, even for an owner that's admittedly close with Harbaugh. So let's start there. Give me some of the head coaching candidates that can maybe do in Baltimore what we saw Mike Macdonald do for the Seattle Seahawks after they moved on from eminently popular and very successful Pete Carroll, and now the Seahawks are actually in better shape than they were 2 years ago.
Well, just following up on what you were saying about Mike Macdonald, there was some thought last year when Mike Macdonald got the job in Seattle that he should have been kept around. They should have figured out a way to keep him around for him to be the head coach in waiting in the event they wanted to move on from John Harbaugh. Much alike when they had GM Eric DeCosta in the front office, who turned down numerous opportunities to either interview or take GM jobs in other places because he was the GM in waiting behind the late. I'm not trying to off Ozzie, the great Ozzie Newsome. By the way, Ozzie Newsome should be the first double Hall of Famer in NFL history because he's had a Hall of Fame playing career and a Hall of Fame front office career. But don't get me started on that. But to your point, some names that should go out there. I saw a report before we got on today that Brian Flores will be interviewing this week, which would be an interesting candidate. There was a report earlier this week saying that there was a combination possibly of Brian Flores as the head coach and Brian Daboll as the OC. We saw that linked to the Raiders. We'll see if that holds true for this process. Anthony.
Hey, Rand, not to interrupt you, but I do want to ask a question because there have been some reports that Harbaugh, who'd been there for 18 years, maybe wasn't on the same page, he and Todd Monken, with Lamar Jackson. Now, that's one thing, but there's some real personalities in B-Flow and Brian Daboll. How does that work with a franchise quarterback and a former MVP?
But and that's where I was going to get to all of that because that's
okay. Sorry, I got excited.
I'm again. I don't know the nature of their relationship. I want to say they may have worked together somewhere, possibly in New England. It'll be interesting to see how those two mesh, right? Because both of them are two fiery guys. Both of them have been head coaches before, so we'll see how that marriage could potentially work. Another name, Anthony Weaver. He's a guy that came from Baltimore to take over as the defensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins. There was some feel that a couple years ago, before they named Zach Orr as the defensive coordinator, that Anthony Weaver was going to be the defensive coordinator there. But the one name that stands out the most to me in this whole process, and maybe it's too much of dot connecting, is Jesse Minter, the defensive coordinator from the Chargers, right? He's a guy that has Baltimore ties, has worked in Baltimore, is coordinating a successful defense out there in Charger land, but he is a young up-and-coming coach. And if you look at the history of the Baltimore Ravens from when they hired Brian Billick back in the day, he was a hotshot young offensive coordinator. They went kind of outside of the box in hiring John Harbaugh, who was a special teams coach. Now, it could be a year early for Jesse Minter in terms of being a head coach, but when you have an established front office like Eric DeCosta and his crew, then you could get by with allowing him to Jesse Minter to be your coach a year early because you have the structure around him. And let's just call it what it is. Baltimore Ravens is one of the more stable organizations in the league. And so you have that to surround this new coach with. And the key for me is not only who's going to be the next head coach, who's going to be the offensive coordinator. Because you have a young guy in Zach Orr, and let me tie that back into Jesse Minter. Jesse Minter is a defensive-minded head coach. Now, because of his ties there, he will allow you to keep Zach Orr as the defensive coordinator, right, and continue to grow, keep that unit together as you try to fix the offense, because he can obviously help with the defense in terms of what, you know, some changes and some nuance to bring to it and still allow Zach Orr to run it. The trick for me is who's going to be able to coordinate this offense and coordinate it in a way that we can see the explosiveness that we've always wanted to see out of this offense that features Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry and Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews and all those guys, right? So the first name that came to mind to me was Cliff Kingsbury. Now, we're going to hear Cliff Kingsbury's name for some of these head coaching jobs. As with as many jobs are open, I mean, they have to be filled. I think it's 8 jobs that are open right now.
Yep.
And to me, I don't understand why some of these colleges didn't reach out to Cliff Kingsbury, particularly with his background of developing young quarterbacks. We saw what his offense could do, what he had, what was it, Jayden Daniels last year, and what Jayden Daniels was able to accomplish as a rookie. Lamar can do all of those same things within this offensive structure, and it will allow for you to push the ball down the field. The offensive run game is pretty much similar, being able to just make one cut and go, which is where Derrick Henry excels. It's similar structure. I think Cliff Kingsbury had Kyler Murray, a 4,000-yard passer, you know, back when Kyler Murray admittedly wasn't even studying film. So I think if he doesn't get a job, him to Baltimore, depending on who the head coach is, would make a ton of sense of being able to get this offense going in the right direction.
Yeah, as a Steelers fan, I do not like the idea of Brian Flores and Cliff Kingsbury coming to Baltimore to fix everything that's wrong. All right, Rand, going to continue to lean on your front office experience here. I'm going to set the table, and I want your thoughts. We're going to look here at the salary cap situation. The Ravens, according to my figures, are currently number 17 in salary cap space, have around $36.8 million. As always, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. They have needs on both sides of the ball, as we talked about here. I'm going to list some of their bigger name free agents, and you tell me what we're doing with some of these players. They traded for Alohi Gilman, the safety. His contract's up. You talked about Isaiah Likely, D-Hop, Kyle Van Noy. You see some of the names here. Tyler Linderbaum, their center. Daniel Faalele, their offensive guard there. Darius Washington, Patrick Ricard, their fullback, who's 300 pounds, former defensive lineman. Tyler Huntley, the backup, who won some games. Charlie Kohler, the backup tight end, who's contributed, and Keaton Mitchell, the running back who looks nothing like Derrick Henry, but when he is healthy, is an absolute burner. So a lot of names there, only 37 or so million to work with. Any of these stick out as guys that must-haves in 2026 and beyond?
Well, I mean, the number one name that jumps off the list to me, just going by the list of free agents on the screen, is Isaiah Likely. Now, you've kind of already made your bed because you extended Mark Andrews, and there's just not enough money to go around to pay both of those tight ends high-level money. And so for me, I would have liked for them to keep Isaiah Likely and move on from Mark Andrews, just because of the value in terms of how much ball do each of those guys have left. To me, that makes more sense. Draymond Jones, a guy who they acquired from the Titans via midseason trade, was one of the guys that was able to consistently get pressure for him. I think you try to figure out something there, because they do have a need on the edge in terms of being able to finally get that pass rusher there. Some of the other names, the Tyler Linderbaum one is tricky because they declined his option, and which also means that you probably don't want to franchise tag him. So what is his value going to be? That's one for them to kind of study, see what the market's going to be for him to be their starting center moving forward. Just probably wasn't enough for them to pick up that 5th-year option or possibly franchise him because of what that tag signifies. And like you said, $36.8 million. With that said, 2 moves that they could make from a cap casualty standpoint to free up even more money. Moving on from Ronnie Stanley, who carries a $9.9 million number next year. But the dead cap number of that would be $38 million. So figuring that part out, because they do have $12.2 million in dead cap carrying over for the 2026 season. And then the other one, which it's a tricky situation, is Nnamdi Madubuike. Is finally figuring out what's going on with that neck. I know that there is some real concerns there as to whether his career is over, if he'll be back. So I know that's something that they're going to keep really quiet throughout the offseason. Baltimore Ravens traditionally have done a really good job of keeping injuries and off-season surgeries and things like that really quiet throughout the offseason, and you don't hear about them until either the player says something or the organization says something publicly, but you don't really get that. So again, and here's the one thing: the Baltimore Ravens have done a solid job in free agency. They go out and get the proven vet, bringing in guys like DeAndre Hopkins. Even when they signed Cal Van Noy a couple years ago, they go out and get the veteran, the proven veteran. But they also have 10 draft picks, right? You have a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and you have 4 5s and 2 7s. And this is where they've made their hay. They build through the draft, they reward and re-sign their own. And so they're going to continue to probably look to do so.
No, I'm glad you mentioned the draft picks. And by the way, you mentioned that the Ravens are really good at keeping secrets about injuries. Clearly, you did not get that memo as you're blasting their business live here on television and on the podcast. So I thank you for the insight.
That's their business, not mine.
Nnamdi Madubuike is so incredibly important to what they do, and we saw how that defense faltered, especially along the defensive line when he got hurt. So we'll see. Keep an eye on that here. But you talked about the draft picks. They're currently picking number 14. Let's play the old game here. I'm gonna give you some potential players that are available around the 14th pick, and you tell me which one is the most immediate impact player in 2026. They have needs all along the offensive line if they get rid of the left tackle and the center, Linderbaum and Stanley. Defensive line as well. Here's some names. Peter Woods, defensive lineman. Should he fall out of Clemson, if he's there at 14. Keldrick Falk, edge rusher out of Auburn. Physical freak, still scratching the surface. And then our guy, left tackle out of Alabama, Caden Proctor. Which one of those guys, if you're Eric DeCosta and the coach to be named later, gives you the biggest bang for buck in 2026?
Peter Woods, Proctor, Falk is how I would rank them in terms of, because Peter Woods is just too good of a player to pass up, especially if I think if you hadn't heard anything about Nnamdi Madubuike's standing with the organization, and just in terms of his injury by the draft, and they take Peter Woods, I think that tells you all you need to know. And they've done traditionally a pretty solid job of being able to get defensive linemen in there and guys that they can keep around and play their style of football. But Peter Woods can do a lot of the things that we've seen Nnamdi Madubuike be able to do in terms of just being able to penetrate, be disruptive. Caden Proctor just fits a Baltimore Raven. If you know Ozzie, he loves his Alabama guys. And so I'm pretty sure he'll be able to go in there and get his background information and be able to be comfortable with taking a guy like that. But you're talking about a big, physical, strong, just nasty, mauling type of offensive lineman that fits the Baltimore Ravens. And then Keldrick Falk, to me, like you said, he has the size, the length, and all those things. He's still developing as a pass rusher. But to me, if you take him that early, you're saying that this guy's plug and play. And that's why I have him below those other two. But he's still going to be a good player for him.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think that list makes sense as well. I'll quickly rip through the Jim Mora version of the playoffs for the Ravens in 2026. This feels like the Seattle Seahawks. You talked about Mike McDonald earlier. They are the most attractive job available for any head coach because they have just about everything in place, starting with their franchise quarterback. The defense battled injuries. I think they can get right. We know what this defense can be when it's healthy because we thought they were going to be fantastic in August, and I think the offense is not far away if you get the right OC in there. So before we take a break, I'll just ask Ravens fans, do you think this is a one-year rebuild situation? And which of those draft picks that we talked about, or even free agents, do you want back? Which one's most important to what you think the Ravens need to do in 2026?